Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for joining me today for Budget 2025, the Coalition Government's second budget. This budget has benefited greatly from the perspectives of each of the parties in the Coalition. In particular, I want to thank the Associate Ministers of Finance, David Seymour, Shane Jones and Chris Bishop, who are heavily involved in this budget and who are available for your questions today. Together, we are making solid progress together to rebuild the government's books, grow the economy and get better results from frontline services. Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge Ian Rennie, Secretary to the Treasury, and his budget team who have supported ministers throughout this process. It's another big job from all of you at the Treasury. Thank you. Budget 2025 is a responsible budget to secure New Zealand's future. This budget supports the economic recovery while also taking a longer-term view, with initiatives to boost investment, growth and savings. Kiwis have been battling through an extended period of high inflation, high interest rates and low growth. Times are still tough for many. The good news is that strong economic and fiscal management is ensuring a recovery is underway, supported by lower interest rates and a strong export performance. This budget builds on that. It supports the recovery by encouraging business investment that will directly lift economic growth and wages. It makes changes to grow the savings of Kiwis. It provides targeted cost of living support for low to middle income families and superannuitants. And it makes responsible savings across government and redirects funding to significant new investment in healthcare, education, law and order and other frontline services. Importantly, Budget 2025 shows the government is on the right path to get the country back to surplus and put debt on a lower track. These slides show that economic recovery is underway. Budget 2025 was obviously put together against a backdrop of global uncertainty due to the introduction of new tariffs. For a small trading nation like New Zealand, the global situation is concerning. But Treasury's growth forecasts demonstrate that the global situation doesn't threaten New Zealand's recovery. It may impact the pace of the recovery, and Treasury has pegged its forecasts back in the near term. But these forecasts show that economic growth is still picking up to very healthy levels. Real GDP growth is expected to accelerate to 2.9% in the 25-26 year and 3% in the year after. Inflation, meanwhile, is forecast to remain steady and within the target band over the forecast period. This government's policies and actions are supporting that to happen. As I noted, growth accelerates as the recovery builds momentum. Wages are expected to grow faster than inflation, and at the end of the forecast period, there are expected to be 240,000 more people in jobs. The wage level at the end of the forecast period is higher than that which was being forecast 6 months ago. This is a bright outlook, although I would never take it for granted. The government's fiscal strategy is focused on returning to surplus, getting debt on a downward track and reducing core Crown expenses as a percentage of GDP. The government's books have taken a hammering over the past 6 years or so. Spending rose sharply and so did government debt, as this graph shows. To make matters worse, there was very little to show for the ballooning spending. The coalition government inherited a structural deficit, that is, a deficit that is not due to one-off events and not due to the current state of the economy, but due to a fundamental mismatch between government spending and revenue, which was caused by a sharp increase in spending and a complete lack of fiscal discipline. Today, you can see how this government's careful management of revenue and expenses will get the country's books back in order. The Obergalex deficit is expected to widen in the near term, then gradually improve after next year, returning to a very small surplus of $200 million by the end of the forecast period. At that point, the structural deficit will have closed. The second key element of the government's fiscal strategy relates to debt. Debt rose sharply from 2019-2020 and continued its steep upward rise following the pandemic. Treasury advises that it is unwise to have government debt over 50% of GDP. I agree with that ceiling. Net core Crown debt is expected to peak at 46% of GDP, slightly lower than forecast at the half-year update 6 months ago, before then beginning to decline. The government's objective is to turn around the debt curve and get it moving down towards 40% of GDP. This is important because higher debt means higher interest costs and therefore less money to fund public services. Higher debt also constrains the government's ability to respond to a shock like an earthquake or a severe weather event. By restoring discipline to public spending, core Crown expenses as a percentage of GDP remain steady and then decline, reaching 30.9% by 28-29. This means the government is on track to meet the third key element of our fiscal strategy, which is to reduce core Crown expenses towards 30% of GDP. As all of these forecasts show, the government is taking a deliberate, medium-term approach to fiscal consolidation. The operating allowance for budget 2025 is $1.3 billion on average per annum. This is the lowest allowance in a decade. Treasury estimates the tighter budget package will see interest rates being 30 basis points lower than they otherwise would have been by the end of the forecast period. That's good news for everyone with debt or a mortgage. Importantly, that $1.3 billion allowance is a net figure. On the one hand, it encompasses new spending, and on the other hand, it contains savings. Budget 2025 makes significant investments to support economic growth. The largest of these is Investment Boost. New Zealand's productivity challenges are well understood. Study after study has identified a low level of capital investment per worker compared to other countries. To lift that productivity, to lift incomes and to drive long-term economic growth, New Zealand needs businesses, big and small, to invest in machinery, in tools, equipment, technology, vehicles, industrial buildings, and other capital assets. Investment Boost is a new tax incentive that will increase investment in New Zealand and support the economic recovery. It allows a business to immediately deduct 20% of the cost of a new asset from its taxable income, on top of depreciation, meaning a much lower tax bill in the year of purchase. It makes investments more attractive, meaning opportunities stack up financially and more will be made. Over 20 years, Investment Boost is expected to lift New Zealand's wages by 1.5% and GDP by 1%. Officials estimate that roughly half those impacts happen in the first 5 years. Notably, the IRD and Treasury have advised, and you will see it in the regulatory impact statement later today, one of the most glowing regulatory impact statements I've ever read, that, quote, the majority of the increase in national income from this policy would flow to workers. This increase would come from a combination of higher wages and higher employment. We therefore expect that the benefits of this policy will be spread broadly across a wide range of New Zealanders. Investment Boost starts today. It will give Kiwi businesses a reason to continue investing in the future of New Zealand. Continuing the growth theme, Budget 2025 creates Invest New Zealand, a one-stop shop for foreign direct investment. Security of energy supply is critical to economic growth, and my colleague Shane Jones has led an initiative to address declining natural gas reserves. This sees $200 million put aside in a contingency for the Crown to potentially co-invest in new gas fields. An additional investment has been made into the Elevate Fund to grow the technology startup sector, and as announced earlier this week, $75 million has been set aside to encourage foreign investment in infrastructure and make it easier for startups to retain great staff. The budget also provides additional funding for screen production rebates to support jobs and growth in that sector, and it funds science and innovation reforms. Together with Investment Boost, these initiatives promote growth and support the recovery. The government is making changes to KiwiSaver to encourage more savings while also making the scheme more fiscally sustainable. KiwiSaver has helped a lot of New Zealanders to save, although many people's balances remain modest. To address this, the default rate of employee and employer contributions will go from 3% to 3.5% on 1 April next year, and from 1 April 2028, it will go to 4%. Phasing this in over a 3-year period helps workers and employers plan ahead. Employees will still be able to opt down to the current 3% rate and still be matched by their employer at that lower rate. This recognises that some people may not be able to afford increased contributions at this time and provides New Zealanders with choice about what suits their circumstances best. The government will also extend employer matching to 16 and 17-year-olds and make them eligible for the government contribution. This will encourage young people to adopt a savings habit and help them build a deposit for their first home. To ensure KiwiSaver's costs to the taxpayer remain sustainable, the annual government contribution will be halved to 25 cents for each dollar a member contributes each year, up to a maximum of just over $260. Members with an income of more than $180,000 will no longer receive the government contribution. These changes do not affect the current year's government contribution, which will be paid out in July and August this year. Putting these changes together, the KiwiSaver balances of employees contributing at the new default rate will grow faster than they do now, providing a larger balance at age 65 or when people come to buy their first home, as you can see from the examples on the fact sheets provided. Savings from changing the government contribution, which come to $2.5 billion over the forecast period, are being used to fund budget priorities, including health, education and law and order. The Retirement Commissioner will have a calculator on the Sorted website at 2 o'clock today when the embargo lifts, and I encourage New Zealanders to go online and see what these policy changes will mean for the size of their nest egg. Turning now to the savings which have enabled investment in public services and infrastructure. As I said earlier, the $1.3 billion operating allowance is a net figure. It encompasses $5 billion a year of new spending and $1.7 billion a year for Investment Boost. On the other hand, the allowance contains savings of $5.3 billion a year, or approximately $21 billion over the forecast period. A significant portion of those savings come from changes to the pay equity regime. Other savings come from a range of areas, including KiwiSaver changes, inland revenue compliance activities, reductions in emergency housing costs. These savings are outlined transparently in the summary of initiatives. As you are aware, pay equity policy settings have changed to ensure future settlements stick to correcting pay discrepancies that arise from sex-based discrimination and not for other reasons. The costs of potential future settlements had blown out under the previous law. To give you a sense of the magnitude of this blowout, when the pay equity regime began in 2020, the estimated costs in Treasury's books for pay equity settlements over the next 4 years was $3.7 billion. Since then, potential costs have risen steeply pretty much every year. This was particularly the case in 2022, when the Labour government took a decision to effectively write a blank cheque for settlements with non-government employers, exposing the taxpayer to potentially billions more in costs without any ability to be at the bargaining table. These cost blowouts were hidden from taxpayers because the amount being forecast was negotiation sensitive. Labour chose to deal with these costs outside of operating allowances. Claims became broad, covering multiple employers and in some cases employees with very different jobs. Cabinet took the decision to change policy settings and focus settlements on correcting proven sex-based discrimination. And I note that unions have indicated they do intend to progress claims under the new law. I encourage them to do so. As a result of the law changes and the government's decision to remove the blank cheque for non-government employers, Budget 2025 returns $12.8 billion from contingencies over the forecast period. A contingency has been retained to fund future public sector pay equity settlements. Any contribution from the government to future non-government settlements in the funded sector will be managed within baselines or against future operating allowances. Unfortunately, I can't tell you the full scale of the blowout in pay equity costs overall, because to do so, I am advised, would reveal how much is contained in our ongoing contingency. However, as you can see from the size of the returned funding, the potential cost of the loose and broken regime was exponentially higher than expected back in 2020. Budget 2025 contains targeted cost of living support, including changes to working for families to better target low and middle income families with changed abatement thresholds and rates. As a result, families with incomes just above the new threshold will get an extra $23 per fortnight from working for families, with this amount reducing gradually as income rises. This will encourage people to work. In all, an estimated 142,000 families with children will receive $14 more per fortnight on average. The vast majority of these families have incomes below $100,000 a year. We know that the cost of living has been tough for them. The cost of this extra support is met from better targeting the first year of the Best Start tax credit. From 1 April next year, the first year of Best Start will no longer be universal, but will become income tested in exactly the same way as the second and third years of that payment have always been income tested. Other cost of living support in this budget includes a shift in the length of time a prescription can be issued for, from 3 to 12 months. That will save Kiwis medical costs and will give health professionals more time to deal with other patients. The budget also helps up to 66,000 additional Super Gold card holders pay their rates. From 1 July this year, the rates rebate scheme will become more generous for Super Gold card holders and their households by increasing the income threshold for eligibility to $45,000 a year and increasing the maximum rebate to $805. I want to acknowledge that this arises from the New Zealand First National Coalition Agreement. In addition, food bank funding of $15 million has been extended for another year. The biggest part of the budget by far is investment in frontline services that Kiwis rely on. Budget 2025 has a significant increase in funding for health, with overall health funding increasing by over 7%, which amounts to more than 6% on a per person basis. It also makes a $1 billion capital investment in hospitals and health facilities. Funding has been allocated for a major redevelopment of Nelson Hospital, including a new 128-bed inpatient building. Funding has also been allocated for a new emergency department at Wellington Regional Hospital. In terms of operating funding, the budget confirms a funding increase of $5.5 billion, previously signalled in last year's budget, for hospital and specialist services, primary care, community health and public health. It also confirms funding of over $1 billion for additional cancer treatments and other medicines, and it includes new funding of $447 million to support increased access to primary care, including urgent care and after-hours services across New Zealand to make it easier for New Zealanders to see a GP or a nurse. Additional aged care funding will also support older people transferring from acute hospital care to community care. At the centre of the education budget is investment in learning support. And I have to say, this is an area of the budget that is very close to my heart. For too long, New Zealand has failed young people with additional learning needs. Young people with communication, physical or behavioural needs have enormous potential. We should not let that potential go untapped. In this budget, we are making a transformational investment in improving the learning support available to those young New Zealanders with additional learning needs. New funding of $646 million operating and $101 million capital is the largest boost to learning support in a generation. It will change the lives of children who need extra support to learn because of physical, behavioural, communication or other learning challenges. It will also benefit their classmates, whose teachers will now be better supported to meet diverse learning needs. The extra budget funding will provide more teacher aid hours, more specialist support, learning support coordinators, an expansion of early intervention services, and new learning support classrooms. There is also new funding in the budget for schools' operational grants, early childhood education and tertiary education subsidies. Extra maths help will be available for students who need it, with $100 million of new funding for early intervention and support. There is a $140 million package of services to lift school attendance, which you've already heard David Seymour speak about. And more than $700 million has been set aside to deliver new schools, purchase sites, expand some schools and build new classrooms. New funding in Budget 2025 continues the government's drive to restore law and order. The budget invests $480 million to support police on the front line to crack down on crime and keep communities safe. The budget invests $472 million to ensure corrections can manage an increase in the prison population, including 580 new frontline staff. The government is also redeveloping Christchurch Men's Prison, reducing court case backlogs and strengthening our border with additional investment in customs. Budget 2025 brings a major uplift in defence spending to ensure New Zealand pulls its weight in an increasingly volatile world. This will be funded across several budgets and includes priority projects like new maritime helicopters. Budget 25 also invests $660 million to improve core Defence Force capabilities across air, sea, land and cyberspace, and new funding of $84 million over 4 years will be used to enhance New Zealand's relationships with Asian countries, address trade barriers and support the government's goal to double exports. Budget 2025 allocates $6.8 billion of new capital expenditure. I've already mentioned most areas: hospitals, schools, the Defence Force, prisons. There is also new capital funding to improve New Zealand's rail network. Train commuters and businesses moving goods around the country will see more reliable rail services thanks to the government's investment of $605 million for rail upgrades and renewals. In summary, Budget 2025 is about growing the economy to help Kiwis get ahead. It is a responsible budget which supports the economic recovery and addresses longer-term challenges. It continues our government's focus on making savings to redirect funding into frontline services like healthcare, education and law and order. And it does all of this while reducing our debt and reducing our unbalanced books and putting us on a track to return to surplus, to get debt down and get government spending to more sustainable levels. And I will now take your questions.